The lawyer's office smelled like fresh paper and old money. 12 floors above the city, and you could still hear the traffic if you listened past the silence. I sat at the end of the long table. My hands were folded. My eyes were steady. Renata sat across from me in a cream-colored coat she didn't need indoors. She had her lawyer on one side and my son Marcus on the other. Marcus would not look at me. "We just want this to be simple, Walter," Renata said. Her voice was soft, the way people make their voice soft right before they take something from you. Colleen would have wanted peace in this family, not a fight over paperwork. She said my late wife's name like she had the right to. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit there, heavy, until it started to bother her. "You're talking about peace," I said, "while you're holding a folder that hands you my company." Her smile didn't move. That was the part nobody warned you about. Not the greed, not even the lie. It was how easy the smile came, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. "It's not about taking anything," she said. "It's about protecting the family. You're 71, Walter. Colleen is gone. Someone has to think clearly right now." "I am thinking clearly," I said. "Clearer than anyone at this table." Her lawyer slid a single envelope across the table. Cream paper. My name typed on the front in a font too formal for anything good. "This is just a formality," the lawyer said. "A transfer of trustee authority. Standard given the circumstances." I looked at Marcus, my son. 38 years old, and he was studying the wood grain of the table like it owed him an answer. "Marcus," I said, "look at me." He didn't. That told me more than the envelope did. I have built things my whole life. A hardware store with a hand-painted sign, a supply company with 400 employees, a marriage that survived 43 years, 2 recessions, and one very long winter in the hospital that I never told anyone about until it was over. I know what it looks like when something is built, and I know exactly what it looks like when something is being stolen. "Before you ask me to sign anything," I said, "I want to ask one question. Just one." Renata's smile flickered. Barely, but I saw it. "Where," I said, "is Colleen's letter?" The room went still. Even the city noise outside seemed to drop away. Renata's lawyer glanced at her. Marcus finally lifted his head, and for half a second, I saw something underneath the silence he'd been wearing all morning. Fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," Renata said. Too fast, too clean. "Don't you?" I said quietly. They forgot who built everything they were trying to steal. I didn't open the envelope that day. I didn't sign it either. But to understand why that smile on Renata's face made my hands go cold under the table, colder than grief ever had, you need to know what happened 3 days earlier, in a hospital records office, with a blood test that should never have mattered to anyone. If you've ever sat at a table with people who smiled while taking something from you, I want to know where you're watching this from. Tell me in the comments. Some of you have lived through worse than I have, and I'd like to hear it. Now let me take you back, not to the lawyer's office. Further than that. 3 days before that meeting, before the envelope, before I knew what Renata really was, I was just a man standing in a quiet house, trying to remember how to live in it without my wife. That's where this really starts. The house was too quiet now. 43 years of noise and then nothing. Colleen used to hum while she made coffee. Some old song with no name, off-key, the same 4 notes every morning. I never told her how much I needed that sound until it was gone. She passed in March, a Tuesday. The kind of ordinary day that has no business holding something that big. I sat with her at the end, held her hand until it went cold, and then for a while after that too, because letting go felt like the last thing I would ever do for her, and I wasn't ready to finish. We built this life from almost nothing. I want you to understand that, because it matters for everything that comes later. In 1979, I had a hardware store the size of a two-car garage and a loan I was terrified to sign. Colleen kept the books at the kitchen table every night, a pencil behind her ear, 2 kids asleep upstairs. She never once told me to give up. Not during the recession in the 80s. Not when we mortgaged the house twice. Not when I came home some nights too ashamed to say how close we'd come to losing everything. By the time I was 50, that garage had become Greaves Supply. 400 employees, 4 warehouses, a name people trusted on every job site in 3 counties. None of it was an accident. None of it came free. Colleen used to say the business was our 3rd child. She wasn't wrong. We raised it the same way we raised Marcus and his sister, with worry, with long nights, with more love than either of us knew we had. After she got sick, I stopped going into the office most days. I sat with her instead, held the basin when the medicine made her ill, read to her in the evenings, books she'd already read twice because the sound of my voice settled her more than the words did. I do not regret a single hour of that. I would give every warehouse I own for one more. What I didn't expect, what no one tells you about grief, is how fast some people start circling before the body is even properly cold. The funeral was on a Saturday. By the following Wednesday, Renata had already asked, gently, almost sweetly, whether I'd thought about simplifying things going forward. I remember standing in the kitchen where Colleen used to hum, holding a cup of coffee I didn't want and thinking, she just buried her mother-in-law 4 days ago and she's already measuring the curtains. I didn't say that out loud. I'm not in the habit of saying things out loud until I'm certain. But I started watching, carefully, quietly. The way I used to watch a bad batch of inventory numbers, not with panic, but with the patient certainty that something underneath didn't add up, and that it would show itself if I waited long enough. I had no idea yet how far underneath it went. Renata came by on a Sunday, 10 days after the funeral. She brought a casserole I never asked for, and a folder I never wanted to see. I know it's a hard time, she said, setting the dish down on the counter like she owned the kitchen. But Marcus and I think it's important to get ahead of things, before anything gets complicated. Complicated, I repeated. Legally, financially. She smiled the way she always smiled, warm on the surface, nothing underneath. You shouldn't have to carry all of this alone, Walter. Not at your age. Not after everything. I poured myself coffee and didn't offer her any. What exactly is it you think I'm carrying alone? She slid the folder across the counter. Trust paperwork. My name on it. A line near the bottom asking for a transfer of trustee authority from me to a newly formed family trust, with Marcus listed as primary trustee, and beneath his name, in smaller print, hers. It's just a safety measure, she said. If something happened to you suddenly, this protects the company, protects the family. You wouldn't want everything tied up in probate for years, would you? Nothing's happened to me, I said. I'm standing right here. Of course. We just want to be prepared. Her eyes were kind, careful, rehearsed. Colleen would have wanted us to take care of you. I set my coffee down slow enough that the sound of the cup on the counter filled the whole kitchen. Don't use her name to ask me for my company, I said. For 1 second, just one, the kindness in her face went somewhere else entirely. Cold, calculating, gone again before I could be sure I'd seen it. I'm not asking for anything for myself, she said, soft again. I'm thinking of Marcus, of the kids, of what happens if the lawyers get involved and start picking apart everything you and Colleen built. The lawyers get involved when people make them get involved. She nodded slowly, like she was disappointed in me, like I was the unreasonable one in the room. I'll leave the folder here, she said. No pressure. Just look it over. I don't need to look it over. The answer is no. Her smile didn't break. That's the part that should have worried me more than it did in that moment. We can talk again soon, she said, picking up her purse. Once you've had time to think clearly. Think clearly. The same phrase she'd use again, weeks later, across that long table in the lawyer's office. She let herself out. I stood in my kitchen holding a folder I had no intention of signing, and underneath the anger, something colder and more useful was starting to form. She hadn't threatened me outright. She was too smart for that. But the shape of the threat was there, sitting quietly under every soft word. Sign this, or things will get complicated for you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call Marcus and demand answers. I have learned over 40 years of business that the moment you show your hand in anger, you've already lost. So I did the only thing that has ever worked for me. I watched, and I waited. The first thing I noticed was the password. I went into the office on a Monday, my first time back since the funeral, and my login to the company server didn't work. Invalid credentials. I tried twice, then called IT. Mr. Greaves, your access was updated last week, the young man said, a little nervous. Marcus's office requested it. Said you wanted a simplified login for ease of use. I never asked for any such thing. Send me the new one, I said, keeping my voice even. It took 3 days to get it. 3 days where I wasn't supposed to need it, apparently. The second thing was smaller, but it sat wrong with me longer. I called the office line one afternoon and heard Marcus's voice for half a second before he realized it was me. And something in his tone changed mid-sentence, like a door closing fast. Dad, hey, I was talking to someone about the warehouse contract. Who? Just a vendor thing, nothing important. I have known my son his entire life. I know the difference between Marcus discussing a vendor contract and Marcus hiding something. The second one has a particular silence in it, right before the lie, like he's deciding how much of the truth he can afford to give away. He gave away none of it. The third thing was the file. I went looking for the original trust documents Colleen and I had drawn up 15 years earlier, long before any of this nonsense with Renata's folder, just to confirm what I already knew about my own company's structure. The physical file, the one kept in the cabinet in my home study, was missing. Not misplaced. Missing. The cabinet had been opened with a key I knew only 3 people possessed. Me, Colleen, and our family lawyer, Arthur Penn, who had held a copy since before Marcus could walk. I called Arthur that evening. Walter, he said, and there was a pause in his voice I didn't like. I was actually going to call you this week. About the trust file? Another pause, longer this time. About a few things, he said carefully. Can we meet in person? I'd rather not discuss this over the phone. That's when the cold feeling in my chest stopped being suspicion and started being certainty. Something was being moved underneath me, quietly, carefully, by people who assumed a grieving 71-year-old man would be too tired, too sad, too slow to notice. They were wrong about the slow part. I sat in my study that night, in the chair Colleen used to call my thinking chair, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront anyone yet. Not Marcus, not Renata, not even Arthur, until I knew exactly what he wanted to tell me. I was going to watch every door they thought was closed and open them myself, quietly, one at a time. The next morning, Arthur called back. His voice had lost its careful tone completely. "Walter," he said, "you need to come in today. It's about the hospital." I hadn't been to the hospital in months, not since Colleen. "What hospital business could possibly involve you?" "Not Colleen's records," he said. "Your grandson's." I sat down slowly in the chair I was already sitting in, if that makes any sense to you. The kind of sitting down you do twice, once with your body and once with your understanding. "What's wrong with Tyler?" "Nothing's wrong with him," Arthur said. "That's not exactly the problem." Arthur's office hadn't changed in 20 years. Same dark wood shelves, same smell of old leather and coffee. He didn't sit behind his desk this time. He sat across from me, like a man preparing to deliver bad news at a hospital, not a law firm. "I need you to understand," he said, "that what I'm about to tell you, I only found by accident. I wasn't looking for it. Arthur, just say it." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A lab report. Hospital letterhead. Tyler's name at the top. My grandson, 8 years old. Marcus and his ex-wife's son. 2 months ago, Tyler had a routine procedure. Tonsils. Standard pre-surgery blood work. Arthur tapped the paper. His blood type came back O negative. Okay. "Walter, Marcus is AB positive. His ex-wife Janine is A positive." He let that sit for a second. 2 parents with those blood types cannot produce a child with O negative blood. It's not possible. Not rare. Not unlikely. Impossible. The room went very quiet. "There's a mistake somewhere," I said, but I heard how weak it sounded coming out of my own mouth. That's what I thought too, so I checked the lab's accreditation. I checked the date against his birth records. I had a colleague who works in genetics review the chart. Arthur's jaw tightened. "There's no error, Walter. Marcus is not Tyler's biological father." I sat there holding a piece of paper that had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with the company, nothing to do with any folder Renata had ever slid across my counter. And somehow it felt like the most dangerous document I had seen yet. "Why are you telling me this?" I said slowly. "Instead of Marcus." "Because Marcus already knows." The words landed like a dropped glass. Slow at first, then all at once. "How long?" "I don't know for certain, but the blood work is 2 months old, and Marcus was the one who picked up Tyler's results from the clinic himself. He signed for them personally." Arthur leaned forward. "Walter, there's something else. The reason I went looking at all of this in the first place wasn't Tyler. It was the trust paperwork Renata had drawn up." "What does Tyler have to do with the trust?" "Everything," Arthur said. "Tyler is named as a primary beneficiary, equal standing to Marcus, ahead of your daughter. If something happens to you, and this new trust structure goes through, Tyler inherits a share of Greaves' supply as if he were your blood grandson." I felt something shift in my chest. cold and slow, like ice settling at the bottom of a glass. Someone wants a child with no blood connection to this family, I said, sitting on a piece of my company. That's what it looks like. Who's the father, Arthur? The real one? He hesitated, and that hesitation told me he already had a guess, and he didn't like it. I don't know yet, he said, but I intend to find out, quietly, before anyone realizes we're looking. I sat back in that worn leather chair and thought about Renata's smile across my kitchen counter, about the folder, about Marcus not meeting my eyes on the phone, about a missing trust file that only 3 people had ever held keys to. This was not simple greed anymore. Greed is messy, impatient, easy to spot. This had been planned, carefully, over years, not weeks. This was bigger than a folder on my counter, I said quietly. This was bigger than greed. This was a long con. And it started long before Colleen ever got sick. Arthur nodded slowly. Walter, he said, I think you need to find out exactly how long before. I didn't tell Marcus. I didn't tell Renata. I didn't even tell my daughter, Diane, though she deserved to know more than anyone. Instead, I hired a man named Frank Delgado. Arthur recommended him, a private investigator who used to do background work for the company decades ago, before he retired and started doing quieter, more personal jobs for people who needed answers without noise. Frank was 60-something, built like a man who'd spent his life lifting things he shouldn't have with eyes that didn't miss much. I need this done carefully, I told him, sitting in his small office above a dry cleaner's. No one can know I'm asking. That's most of my business, Mr. Greaves, he said. Tell me what you've got. I told him everything. The folder, the locked-out login, the missing trust file, the blood test. Frank wrote almost nothing down. He just listened, the way Colleen used to listen when I was working through a problem out loud, letting me get to the end of my own thought before he said anything. 3 things to chase, he said finally. Who fathered the boy? Who moved your trust file? And who's been touching your company's books? Because nobody builds a trust scheme this patient without already having a hand in the money. It took him 11 days. The trust file was the easiest piece. Security footage from my own house, a camera I'd installed years ago over the garage, mostly forgotten, showed Renata's car in my driveway on a day I was at a grief support meeting Diane had talked me into attending. 18 minutes. Long enough to open a cabinet and walk back out with a folder under her coat. She had a key, Frank said, showing me the footage on his laptop. Either she's good at picking locks, which I doubt, or somebody gave her one. Marcus had a copy of mine, from years back, in case of emergencies. There's your answer. The blood test took longer, and it took us somewhere I didn't expect. Frank pulled employment records, old emails, expense reports, the kind of paper trail people forget exists because it's boring, because nobody imagines anyone will ever look. He found a pattern of late-night calendar entries between Renata and one specific name, going back almost 9 years. Long before Tyler was born. Long before Renata had even married Marcus. David Castellano, my CFO. The man who had managed Greaves Supply's books for the last 12 years. A man I trusted enough to give the keys to the company's entire financial structure. They've known each other a long time, Frank said carefully. Longer than her marriage to your son. I sat very still in that small office above the dry cleaners, listening to traffic through a window that didn't close all the way, and felt something inside me go quiet in a way that wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before a decision you can't take back. Keep digging, I've just shown. I want to know what David's done with my books, not just my family. Frank nodded slowly, already reaching for another folder. One more thing, he said. While I was in the company's old vendor records, I found something that didn't belong there. A shell company, registered 9 years ago. Same year, Mr. Greaves, that David started managing your pension contributions directly. He turned the laptop toward me. The company was called Hearthstone Logistics Group. I had never heard of it in my life. Hearthstone Logistics Group didn't have a warehouse. It didn't have a website that worked. It had a P.O. box in a town 40 minutes from here and a bank account that had moved over $2 million in the last 6 years. Frank laid it out for me piece by piece, the way you'd lay out a body's worth of evidence, slow enough that I could absorb each one before the next landed. Every quarter, your pension fund makes a contribution to a logistics consulting retainer, he said. Small enough nobody questions it on a financial statement that size. David approves it personally each time, has for 6 years. Where does the money actually go? Hearthstone's account splits it 3 ways every time, within 48 hours. One portion stays in the company as a buffer, so it looks legitimate if anyone ever audits the shell itself. One portion goes to an account under David's mother's name, clean, untraceable on paper, but she's 83 and lives in an assisted facility in Ohio, Mr. Greaves. She didn't open that account. And the third? Frank slid another paper across the desk. A property deed. A lake house in Michigan, paid in full 4 years ago. Titles under Hearthstone Logistics. But the insurance policy, the utility bills, all of it routes to one phone number. He paused. Renata's. I sat with that for a long moment. A lake house. Bought with money skimmed from the retirement accounts of 400 employees who trusted me to protect what they'd earned. Men and women who'd worked the warehouse floor for 20, 30 years, who were counting on that fund to mean something when their knees finally gave out. $2 million, I said quietly. That's not an affair anymore, Frank. That's theft from people who've never met either one of them. There's more, he said. I cross-referenced the dates the lake house insurance changed hands. Same month Tyler was born. I closed my eyes. If Renata had planned this with David for 9 years, I said slowly, if the boy, the money, the trust file, all of it connects back to the two of them, then I need to know one more thing before I do anything else. What's that? Does my son know any of it? All of it? Or is he just another person they're using? Frank didn't answer right away, and I understood why. He didn't have proof yet, one way or the other. But something in the careful way he set the next folder down told me he already suspected which answer was coming, and that it wasn't the one I was hoping for. There's a phone record, he said finally. From the week before Colleen passed. A call between Marcus and David that ran 14 minutes. I don't have the content. I only have the fact that it happened, and that it's the only call between those two numbers in 3 years. 14 minutes. The week my wife was dying. Find out what was said on that call, I told him. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. If Marcus had been part of this, Frank said carefully, watching my face, would you still want to know? I thought about my son avoiding my eyes on the phone, about the silence he wore like a coat every time I was in the room lately. If he had a hand in this, I said, I need to know exactly how deep that hand went in, because right now I don't know if I'm protecting my son from them, or protecting myself from my son. Frank called me 4 days later, and I could tell from the first word that it wasn't good news dressed up to look bearable. "Sit down before you read this," he said. "I'm sending it now." It was a transcript, not a recording. Frank wouldn't say how he got the content of that 14-minute call, and I didn't ask. But a written account he stood behind completely. I read it standing in my study, in the chair Colleen used to call my thinking chair, and by the third line I understood why he'd told me to sit. "David, she's getting worse. The doctor told Walter it could be weeks." "Marcus, I know, I was there yesterday." "David, we need the trust finalized before anything happens to her, or before he's too far gone in grief to push back. Renata thinks if we wait until after the funeral, he'll be too distracted to read the fine print." "Marcus, and Tyler's part of it. You're sure that holds up legally?" "David, as long as nobody runs a blood panel, it holds up fine. He's listed as your son on the birth certificate. That's all the law needs." "Marcus, and if my mother finds out before she goes? About any of it?" "David, she won't. She's barely lucid most days now. Focus on your father. He's the only one who matters once she's gone." I had to read that last line 3 times before it settled all the way into my chest. He's the only one who matters once she's gone. My son had known. Not suspected. Known. About the trust. About Tyler. About David and Renata. And how long that had been going on. And what they intended to do with my company once Colleen wasn't there to notice. He had known while I held his mother's hand at the end, while I sat up nights reading to her from books she'd already finished twice, while I stood at her funeral and Marcus put his hand on my shoulder and told me he was there for me, whatever I needed. He was not a victim in any of this. He was part of it. I thought about every soft conversation since Colleen died, every "we just want to simplify things," every "you shouldn't carry this alone," and understood, finally, that none of it had ever been about protecting me. It had been about managing me, timing me, waiting for grief to make me slow enough to sign. They hadn't just stolen money from a pension fund full of people who trusted me. They had stolen the last months I had with my wife, turned them into a countdown on somebody else's calendar. My grief had been used as cover for their crime. I sat in that chair for a long time without moving. I am not ashamed to tell you I cried. Not loudly, not the way grief had let me cry for Colleen, but the quieter kind. The kind that comes when you realize the people you raised and trusted had been studying your weakest moment, waiting for it to be useful to them. But grief, I have learned, can sit right next to something colder. And that night, sitting alone in my study with a transcript in my hands, the cold part finally took over. I picked up the phone and called Arthur. "I know everything now," I said. "All of it. David, Renata, the trust, the pension fund, and my son." "Walter." "Don't tell me to slow down," I said. "I've been slow for 2 months. I'm done being slow. What do you want to do?" I looked at the transcript one more time, at the line about Colleen, at the line about being the only one who mattered once she was gone. "I want them to think they've already won," I said. "I want them comfortable, confident, smiling, the way Renata smiles." I took a breath. "And then I want to take every single thing away from them, in a room full of witnesses, the same way they plan to take everything from me." I called Renata myself, not Marcus, not Arthur on my behalf. Me. "I've thought it over," I told her, letting my voice sit lower than usual, a little unsteady. The voice of a man who'd stopped fighting. You were right. I can't carry all of this alone anymore." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her deciding whether to sound surprised or sympathetic. She chose both. "Oh, Walter, I'm so glad you've had time to think clearly." That phrase again. Think clearly. This is the right decision. For everyone. "I'd like to do it properly," I said. "In front of the lawyers. Marcus there, you there. I want it done in one sitting, so I don't have to think about it twice." "Of course. Whatever you need." I let a tremble creep into my next sentence, the kind I'd heard in my own voice plenty of times that winter Colleen was sick. Except this time I was choosing it on purpose. "I just want it over with, Renata. I'm tired." "I understand completely," she said, and I could hear, underneath the gentleness, something that almost sounded like relief. I hung up and sat in the dark for a while. Over the next 9 days, I played the part the way you'd rehearse for a role you intended to win an award for. I let Marcus see me sitting too long in Colleen's chair, staring at nothing. I let Renata catch me looking at an old photo of Colleen and me on our wedding day, holding it a little too long when she walked into the room, setting it down slowly like the weight of it was almost too much. I let my hands tremble when David came by the house to go over the paperwork, watching him sit in my study with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. "It's a lot to absorb," he said gently, sliding documents across the desk. "Take your time, Walter." I signed nothing. I asked careful, slightly confused questions, the kind a tired old man might ask. I let him explain things to me twice, patient and condescending, like he was talking to someone whose mind had started slipping. Inside, I was doing arithmetic, counting every lie, filing every smile. Behind the scenes, Arthur and Frank were not resting. Arthur quietly notified the pension fund's federal oversight contact, laying groundwork for a freeze the moment we were ready to move. Frank finished tracing every dollar through Hearthstone Logistics, building a paper trail clean enough to survive a courtroom. A forensic accountant Arthur trusted completed a full audit of 6 years of consulting retainers, matched dollar for dollar against the lake house, against the account under David's elderly mother's name. And quietly, carefully, a second blood panel was run on Tyler. Not to hurt that boy, who had done nothing wrong in any of this, but to remove any doubt before the truth became public in a room full of people who would try to deny it. By the 9th day, everything was in place. The board meeting was scheduled. Renata had arranged it herself, eager, generous, accommodating. "Whatever makes this easiest for you, Walter." The night before, Marcus came by the house alone. He sat across from me in the kitchen where his mother used to hum over the coffee maker, and for a moment I almost saw the boy he used to be before any of this. "Are you doing okay, Dad?" he asked. "About all this?" I looked at my son, 38 years old, a father who had sat on a truth about his own child for 2 months while it served someone else's plan, a son who had timed his mother's dying days around a trust document. "I'm tired, Marcus," I said quietly. "I just want it finished." He nodded, relieved, and reached over to pat my hand the way you'd comfort someone who couldn't fight back anymore. "It will be," he said. "Tomorrow, it'll all be finished." He had no idea how right he was. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the road, I picked up the phone and called Arthur. "Everything's ready, Moss," I said. "Tomorrow, the weak old man stops existing." The boardroom was the same one I'd sat in for 30 years, the long table polished the way it always was, sunlight cutting across it in the late morning. Renata wore the cream coat again. Marcus sat beside her, and David sat at the far end, comfortable, the way a man sits when he believes the meeting is already decided. Arthur sat to my right. That alone made Renata's smile falter, just slightly, when she walked in and saw him there with a thick folder in front of him, instead of the thin one she'd been expecting. "I thought we agreed this would be simple," she said, glancing at the folder. "It will be," I said. "Eventually." The trust documents were placed in front of me. Marcus's hand hovered near a pen, ready to slide it toward me the moment I reached for it. Renata's eyes had that same soft, patient warmth she'd worn in my kitchen weeks ago. "Whenever you're ready, Walter," she said gently. I didn't reach for the pen. "Before I sign anything," I said, "I want to ask about Hearthstone Logistics Group." The warmth drained out of her face in less than a second. David sat up straighter at the far end of the table. "I don't know what that is," Renata said. "You will in a moment." I nodded to Arthur. He opened the folder and slid the first document across the table, the shell company's registration, 6 years old, David's signature at the bottom as authorizing officer. "This is a logistics consulting arrangement," David said quickly. "Standard vendor relationship. Walter, I can explain the retainer structure if—" "You can," I said. "Explain the lake house, too. The one under Hearthstone's title. The one with insurance and utilities running to my daughter-in-law's phone number." Renata's lawyer leaned toward her, whispering. She shook her head once, sharp, telling him to wait. Arthur slid the second document. 6 years of pension fund transfers, dollar for dollar, matched against Hearthstone's bank withdrawals, matched against the property deed. $2,100,000, Arthur said calmly, taken from the retirement accounts of 400 employees who trusted this company to protect their futures. "This is a misunderstanding," David said, his voice climbing. "These transfers were approved by you," I said, "every quarter, for 6 years." Marcus had gone very pale, his eyes moving between David and Renata like a man watching his own ground disappear beneath him in real time. "Dad," he started, "I didn't know about the money. I swear—" "Don't," I said, and something in my voice made him stop completely. "We'll get to what you knew." I nodded to Arthur again. The third document, a copy of Tyler's blood panel, the original and the second confirmation test side by side, with a brief letter from the lab explaining, in plain terms, why a child with O-negative blood could not biologically belong to 2 parents with the blood types on record. Renata's hand went to the table, steadying herself. "That doesn't prove anything," she said, but her voice had lost every bit of its softness now. "It proves Tyler isn't Marcus's biological son," I said quietly. "It doesn't take much more to find out whose son he is. David's mother's bank account already told us where the money went. The dates told us when the affair started. 9 years, Renata. 9 years before you ever stood in my kitchen calling me family." David's face had gone the color of old paper. He didn't deny it. That silence said more than any document Arthur had brought. "And then there's this," I said, and slid the final piece across the table myself. The transcript Frank had pulled. The 14-minute call from the week Colleen was dying. Marcus read 3 lines and stopped. He didn't need to read further. He already knew what was on that page because he'd said it himself. "He's the only one who matters once she's gone," I read aloud, watching my son's face as the words landed on him from across a table instead of a phone line. "You said that about your own mother, Marcus, while she was still breathing." Nobody at that table said anything for a long moment. "Effective this morning," Arthur said, breaking the silence. The pension fund's federal contact has frozen all activity connected to Hearthstone Logistics Group, pending a full fraud investigation. Mr. Castellano's employment with Greaves Supply is terminated, effective immediately, and the matter has been referred to the appropriate authorities. David stood up so fast, his chair scraped against the floor. Walter, we can discuss this privately. There's no need to There was a need, I said, 9 years ago, to tell the truth. You chose differently. Renata hadn't moved. She sat there in her cream coat, the smile completely gone now, replaced by something far more honest. Fear, calculation, the look of someone realizing every door in the room had already been closed before she'd even sat down. As for the trust, I said, turning the unsigned document face down on the table, there will be no transfer of authority. Not to you, not to a child who isn't my blood, regardless of what's written on a birth certificate. Greaves Supply stays exactly where it's always been, with me and with the people who actually earned a place in it. I looked at my son last. You have a lot to answer for, Marcus, I said. Not to me first. To your mother. If there's any way to make peace with a woman who isn't here to forgive you herself, I don't know if you'll ever manage that. He had nothing to say. For the first time since Colleen died, I watched my son fully understand what silence costs. It took 4 months for everything to settle into its final shape, the way storms do, loud and fast at first, then a long, quiet cleanup afterward that nobody sees on the news. David was charged with fraud and embezzlement. The federal investigation into Hearthstone Logistics confirmed everything Frank had found, and more besides. 3 other shell arrangements David had quietly built over the years, smaller, but cut from the same pattern. He's awaiting trial now. I'm told the lake house in Michigan has already been seized, the proceeds set aside for restitution to the pension fund. Every employee whose retirement had been quietly skimmed for 6 years was made whole. That mattered to me more than almost anything else in this story. Men and women who'd given decades of their lives to a company I built with my own hands. They didn't sign up to lose a piece of their future to somebody's lake house. Renata is gone. Divorced from Marcus within 2 months, though I suspect that decision was made for her more than by her. Once it became clear there was nothing left in this family worth staying for. I don't know where she lives now, and I find I don't think about her nearly as often as I expected to. Tyler is still my grandson, in every way that has ever mattered. Blood is a fact. Love is a choice, and I made mine the day that boy was born, long before any test could complicate it. He doesn't understand most of what happened, and he never will, not from me. He'll grow up knowing he has a grandfather who shows up, and that's the only inheritance that boy needs from any of this. Marcus and I are not where we were. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't pretend it doesn't still ache somewhere underneath my ribs most mornings. He has apologized more times than I can count, and I believe some of it is real. But trust, once it's been spent the way his was spent, doesn't refill itself on an apology. It refills slowly, if it refills at all, one ordinary Tuesday at a time, over years, the same way Colleen and I built everything we ever had. He still has a place in the company, a smaller one than before, earned back from the bottom instead of handed to him from the top. I think, in some strange way, that's better for him than anything I could have simply given. I sit in my study most evenings now, in the chair Colleen used to call my thinking chair, and I don't feel triumphant about any of it. There's no part of this that feels like winning. I lost my wife, and in the same year, I learned exactly how little some of my own family thought of me once they believed grief had made me weak. But I learned something else, too. Something I think Colleen would have wanted me to carry forward more than any anger. They mistook my patience for weakness. They mistook my grief for an opportunity. And in the end, the same quiet, careful watching that built a hardware store into a company 400 families depend on, that same patience is what brought every one of them down, without me ever having to raise my voice. Family is not blood alone. Family is loyalty. And loyalty, once it's forged, can never be trusted again. I think Colleen would have understood that better than anyone. She spent 43 years building something with me out of nothing but patience and trust. I intend to spend whatever years I have left protecting it,